Well, good day, everybody. Thank you all for joining. It's very exciting to see such a heavy turnout for this topic on chemical use disclosure. My name is Adam Wienert, and along with Terry Goldberg, we will be presenting today on chemical use disclosure. To begin, we're just going to run through the webinar agenda. We're going to be taking a look at some chemical use reporting efforts now in place among different agencies and groups, talk some about the purpose of chemical use disclosure, and then we'll be spending some time online reviewing two systems that are currently available to the public, the Washington Department of Ecology's website on children's safe products, and also the IMERC database, which stands for the Interstate Mercury Education and Reduction Clearinghouse. It's a mercury added products database. So we'll take some time reviewing those two systems, talking a bit about the uses of disclosure data, and then we'll talk some about the IC2, the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse, some of the collaboration that's happening between the states of the IC2 and how it relates to chemical use disclosure. And then we'll be talking about some next steps for this overall project about chemical use disclosure, and end with hopefully about 30 or 40 minutes for questions and discussions. Before we move forward, I do want to take a moment to thank the John Merck Fund for funding this project on chemical use disclosure and their interest in the topic. I also want to thank our colleagues at the GC3, the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, and also the BizNGO Network and their help in promoting this webinar today and this overall effort. And also wanted just to put down a couple of ground rules for how we're going to work with the questions and discussions later on. Obviously, with this amount of people, we're not going to be able to have open phone lines for everyone. So during the presentation, if you do have a question at any point, please feel free to either write the entire question down using the question functionality in the webinar control panel that you each have, or you can just simply state that I have a question or something to that effect, and I will make sure to call on you during the question and answer session so that you can actually ask your question and don't have to spend the time to write the entire question out. If you do want to be involved in the discussion, either answering a specific question or if you have something to add to the discussion, there is a raise your hand functionality with the GoToWebinar. It's just a picture of a little hand there. If you just click on that, that will notify me that you're interested in having your phone unmuted, and we'll be happy to do that for you so you can talk. However, I would urge, if you do have a muting ability for your phones, if you could just mute your phone now so that if we eventually do unmute you during the discussion period, there won't be any background noise immediately on the lines. With that, let us begin. So before we get going into the examples, I do want to talk a little bit about this project and some of the goals that we're looking at for this project. We're really seeing this webinar today as a way to begin a series of discussions and meetings among stakeholders over the next 6 months or so to help shape the future of chemical use disclosure resources. This is a pretty early time in some of the state efforts regarding chemical use disclosure, so it's a very important time for us to get stakeholder input about the way that chemical use reporting is going to happen and how it's going to ultimately be displayed so that that kind of information can get built into the systems that are being considered. We're going to identify some elements through this project of current disclosure systems that can be used as models for future programs, and also develop some examples of reports and ways to disseminate this chemical use information. When we were thinking about how to go about asking for stakeholder input, we really came down to a few different questions to put in front of stakeholders. What questions do users want to address using this chemical use data? Again, it's very important for us to understand what the end result or the end desire is for this information so that we can make sure that information coming into the systems is available and can answer those kinds of questions. So ultimately, what information is needed to answer the questions that stakeholders want to be asking? And finally, how do we analyze and present data and turn that information into knowledge and action? And going along with that, what is the messaging that goes out with some of this information? Certainly there is concern over some chemicals that will be disclosed through these programs, but others don't necessarily mean if a chemical is included on a list or part of the disclosure program, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is an inherent hazard with it or that there is any kind of worry. So we need to work on the messaging and making sure that the correct message is being put out there. Now, chemical use disclosure is happening in many ways among many different organizations and has for some time. These are just a few examples that we put up here on the screen. There are certainly other examples as well, including private companies and organizations that are disclosing information. And this disclosure is coming in a variety of ways. It's coming on products themselves, through websites. It's coming through a number of different formats, different document types, through just regular computer code or PDFs, Excel spreadsheets, lots of different ways, MSDS sheets. And this is, obviously, there are a lot of examples and ways that we can think about chemical use disclosure using these types of examples through private organizations, NGOs, and the federal government. What we're going to be spending time today, though, is thinking about the states and the state chemical use disclosure that Terry and I are involved with and most familiar with. And just a note on acronyms, you'll see IMERC throughout this presentation. Again, IMERC stands for the Interstate Mercury Education and Reduction Clearinghouse, and it's a program that is looking at mercury use in products, both consumer products and also industrial products as well. That, along with the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse, the IC2, those are both programs that are run out of the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association, the organization that Terry and I belong to here in Boston. And these, again, are the programs that we are most involved with regarding chemical use disclosure. So we're going to be taking a more specific look at IMERC and the Mercury Added Products Database, and talking a little bit about the states that have enacted mercury reduction laws. Currently, there are 15 member states of IMERC with a variety of mercury reduction laws, from notification and labeling to product bans. We'll be looking at Washington Department of Ecology program in detail as well, the Children's Safe Products Act. Many of you might be familiar with that act and the reporting of 66 priority chemicals. That online database is available now, and we are going to take a more specific look at that. In addition, there are other states. All of the states here on this list do belong to the IC2, and some have programs in place or are going to have programs in place very soon. In Maine, under their chemicals in children's products, they have required reporting on 4 chemicals so far: BPA, nonylphenol, and nonylphenol ethoxylates. That information is not in a publicly available database. The California Safer Consumer Products, that's in the final stages of comment, and I know there are a number of California DTSC colleagues on the line today, so they might be able to answer more specific questions about where the program is at and the use disclosure elements of it. New York as well is looking at chemical use in cleaning products. The one interesting thing to note here about the New York program is that instead of looking at specific chemicals and developing a list of chemicals to report on, New York is actually looking the other way. They are looking at the products themselves and discussing disclosure of the ingredients in those products. So it is a little bit different than the other states and the way that they're looking at things, but it's certainly a program that we're working with and working with New York on. And additionally, Oregon and Minnesota have recently introduced legislation this session that both contain elements of chemical use disclosure as well. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Terry to talk about some of the reasons for disclosure.
Thank you, Adam. So before we get into the actual examination of some of these existing databases, we thought it'd be important to sort of lay out some of the reasons why chemical use disclosure is of interest to the folks that we work with and others, and why these requirements have been put in place in the various states that have these this authority that Adam just laid out. So obviously one important reason is compliance with the state requirements. The states need to understand the universe of companies that use chemicals of concern in products, and part of this compliance is to understand who that universe is and what the universe of products is. So compliance is obviously a critical factor for the states. But beyond that, there's a lot of interest in sustainability efforts, particularly as it applies to various supply chains. And so understanding chemical use and chemicals as they move through supply chains is something the states are particularly interested in. This entire effort is certainly, in response to increasing consumer interest in greener products and understanding the constituents in the products they purchase, wanting to avoid chemicals that the public understands are of concern. And so, obviously these reporting requirements is one of the responses to this push for greener products. In terms of creating a level playing field for informed purchasing decisions, this is important for both the regular consumer and government agencies involved in trying to procure environmentally preferable products. Having a pretty good understanding of which products contain, again, chemicals of concern or not, it can help inform those purchasing decisions. So for looking at alternatives, for example, it's very important to understand, if you're doing an alternatives assessment, where certain chemicals are used and which products, and you can then evaluate the alternatives for those particular products and applications. And sort of in the long view, it seems to me, where there aren't safer alternatives for some of these chemicals of concern in consumer products, obviously that identifies some opportunities potentially for green chemistry efforts and green chemistry research, which we consider an important aspect of all of this, is moving towards green chemistry. Next slide, Adam. So other reasons for disclosure we've already talked about. The need to know what's the universe of companies that use or manufacture and or distribute products with chemicals of high concern in them, so that we understand sort of more about the potentially regulated universe should other additional requirements come into play. Obviously, this information can be useful to policymakers who want to guide future efforts if they have a better understanding of where some of these chemical uses are. It may help them think about either other policy tools they might want to employ to address some of these chemicals, perhaps product labeling, other policy initiatives they might want to undertake. In terms of end-of-life management, this has been particularly important in the mercury area, understanding what products contain mercury to help inform end-of-life management solutions, be they recycling, reuse, disposal, that kind of thing. And that can certainly prove to be true in other product categories where we need to know more about those products so we can either promote more recycling if that's feasible, or other alternatives. Sort of the bottom line here from the Washington Department of Ecology, this is sort of a quote from their work, is we really need to focus attention on those chemicals where there's the greatest opportunities for improvement exists. And this seems to sort of summarize a lot of what we just said, but it's worth restating that a lot of this is to focus our attention where we can make a difference. Adam, I'm going to turn it back over to you and can begin to look at some of this in particular, some of these systems.
Great, thanks, Terry. So we're going to begin by looking at the Washington system that was developed under their Children's Safe Products Act. And it's nice to see that John Williams is on the phone on the webinar here, so that if I do miss anything, he can help correct me at the end. But the Washington system was developed in response to their reporting list of chemicals of high concern. So they developed a large list of priority chemicals, which they narrowed down to 66 chemicals that they are now requiring reporting on. They've developed an entire e-filing system for companies to come in and submit that information, and we're going to take a look at the public access side, the ability to search that data that is entered into their system. The first reporting cycle ended in August 2012. It involved the largest manufacturers, those with sales, I believe, over $1 billion. And they're reporting Tier 1 products. And the Tier 1 products are identified as those that are geared towards children under the age of 3. The second cycle is ending at the end of this month, in February 2013. And the reporting is going to continue for a number of years. Moving forward, every 6 months or so, a new level of manufacturer and product is added to the reporting requirements. So as we think about these questions about what kind of questions we want to ask the data in these systems, with the Washington information, there's also a question of the timing when those questions are going to happen. Is it appropriate to ask these questions now, or are those questions really going to change as more information comes into the system? The categorization of products is done through the GS1 Global Product Classification System at a quote-unquote brick level. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we look at the system. But categorization and the way that products are grouped is a very important thing. We certainly have learned a lot through our work already with the Mercury Added Products database about categorization and some of the challenges and benefits to that. And Washington will be going through their compliance. Part of their compliance strategy is product testing. They will be looking at specific products and making sure that the reported information matches the test results that they receive. So I'm going to switch over now to the online system. And we'll start taking a look at the interface. So this is the Children's Safe Products Act reports website. It enables users to search by essentially 3 different ways: by the chemicals, the 66 chemicals that they are requiring reporting on; also by company, listings of the companies that have so far reported; and also the product search. So we'll begin with the chemical search. Really 2 ways to go about getting at the chemicals, the first being the CAS numbers themselves, and the second being the chemical names. The chemical CAS numbers I'm actually going to skip over because those are just the listings of the actual CASs, but the chemical names will give you the same basic look at what the page enables you to do. So from here, from the chemical name, you are provided the drop-down menu of the 66 chemicals. In this case, I'm going to come down and pick Cobalt. And then it has search dates, so you're able to search records that have come into the system surrounded by certain date fields. In this example, we'll start at the beginning, so we get all the reports for Cobalt that have been reported so far. And it's a very simple, intuitive interface that they've developed for this. Now, the reason I brought up Cobalt was just it was a good example of, first, one of the larger reports so far. It has 643 records, and just for reference, the system itself has just over 2,400 records so far. Again, this is the first reporting cycle. And this report on Cobalt gives a pretty good flavor of some of the various uses of Cobalt, both in different product types, also in different components, and the different functions as well of Cobalt in these products. So it's a really good, it gives a good sense, I think, of how complex these relationships can be, how complex these data systems can be, and how people are going to be asking questions about Cobalt use in products. There's certainly no one answer for why it's being used or where it's being used. One thing I did want to point out before moving on to a new search criteria is this text in red that Washington has put in. And again, this gets down to our thoughts about messaging and how to actually portray the information. and Washington has been very diligent in putting out this information that the reports, the presence of a chemical in a product does not necessarily mean that the product is harmful or that they're violating any existing safety standards. I think there certainly is an ability for someone to see something on a list and immediately get worried. So there is a lot of concern among the IC2 states about making sure that the messaging about their programs and about the products and chemicals that they're asking for reporting, that it doesn't necessarily mean that it is a bad thing. So again, Washington has taken this effort, but one part of our project is really to try to refine this kind of messaging and really understand what how to go about that. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to, again, stay within the chemical search, but I'm going to search by chemical function. And here, again, there's a relatively manageable list of functions that these chemicals serve within the products. One that I did want to actually bring up, is I thought it was particularly interesting personally, was the no function or contaminant listing. And again, we'll put in the dates for the search and view the report. And interestingly, of the 2,400 products or records that are in the system, the function for the chemical is listed as no function for over half of them, and I thought that was particularly interesting. So there's certainly, there's, to me, a new set of questions here regarding chemical use disclosure and the fact that these chemicals really do not have a function within the products themselves. Now, looking at these values, obviously 1,200 is a lot of material to go through a web interface. So Washington has developed a way to download this information and export it into several formats. Using the little save icon here, you can export it into a variety of formats, some more database heavy than others. I wanted to show you just a quick example of what this report looks like. I chose the CSV, or comma delimited option, which brings it up into an Excel spreadsheet. I'm just going to open that spreadsheet right now just to give you a sense of what this looks like, and the ability to actually begin to do some searching and begin to understand some of the ways that this information can be played with and some of the stories that it begins to tell. Again, this function is no function contaminant, so that is not listed here, but it does list the chemicals that were part of that report, the component names, so the component part of the product that they exist in does also give concentrations. And also here in column E gives the product description. So you can see just off the top the variety of products that styrene has come up in as a contaminant. So again, it's very interesting information to be able to parse out the types of products and the chemicals, and really try to you begin to see the breadth of where, for this particular example, where styrene is a contaminant in a number of different types of products, which brings up a whole set of questions, I think. So going back to the system itself, for 1 sec, we're going to go back to the main search. The database does enable a company search, so you can search by company name for those companies that have reported thus far. Right now, again, it's a pretty manageable list, but of course, as the database begins to grow, the list will begin to grow as well. One thing to note here about the company information is that we've found with our experience with the Mercury Added Products database that products that a consumer might find on the shelf, or you might see a brand name on the package of a mercury-containing product, does not necessarily match the company that was doing the reporting for the chemical use disclosure. And while information like this for the company is very valuable in understanding the universe of manufacturers that make these products, and is very helpful for contacting and doing outreach if other states do eventually have these disclosure requirements, the usefulness to the public is a separate question, I think. And how valuable is it for the public to be able to come in and see a company name? They might not be able to understand the products and how they're associated with the company. So that's just a word of note that we have found with the Mercury products database is that there was, and because of that, there was a lot of back and forth between companies and the member states trying to understand relationships between parent companies and importers and a whole variety of things. So it's certainly more complex, I believe, underneath than it seems to be on the surface, at least. But again, that's not to say that that company information can't be a useful thing for the public. It's just, again, a question, does there need to be more analysis? Does there need to be a different way to actually link those companies and those company listings with information that the public might be more either interested or familiar with? And finally, the last interface we're going to take a look at is the product search. Again, you can look by the BRIC code, which is just the code number, just like the CAS number. I'm going to skip over there and go to the product BRIC description, just to give you a sense of what that list looks like. And again, it's the list itself is actually quite large. This categorization scheme, there are certainly some pros and some cons, I think, regarding the usability of it. It's certainly very valuable that Washington used a categorization scheme that many national and international companies are familiar with. These BRIC codes are very ingrained in the overall systems of these companies and the supply chain. So there's a familiarity with it. And there's also a consistency. Certainly, companies will be using the same kinds of codes to recognize similar products. So there's a consistency when you're doing data analysis to be looking at a company across companies and understanding the products will probably be very similar at this level. However, as you might be able to tell just by looking at the list in the beginning, the thing will mean a much different thing to a public user. So what is really the difference between artist accessories and artist paints and dyes? And understanding those differences, again, it's about the questions that we're going to ask and where the public sees this information. Do they see the usefulness in it at this level? Or, again, is there more information needed to be able to take these BRIC levels and translate that into something that the public can understand? And finally, we're going to take a look at the product component name. Again, this is a much more manageable list to take a look at least now in the development of the database, looking at the different components where these chemicals actually exist in the products. And the note that I wanted to make here is that I think this is very interesting, has the potential for asking interesting questions when we start thinking about alternatives and how chemicals are used within certain products. You know, if a chemical exists in a component, in one type of component versus another type of component, that is going to affect in some way the assessments that are done on that chemical for alternatives, and you might get different results. So I think this information within the product component arena brings up some interesting questions regarding alternatives and moving forward with those efforts. So that's the basic user interface. Again, it's a very simple interface that Washington developed for the products in their system right now. And again, there will be an increase in the number very shortly as the second round of reporting ends. But I just want to switch over quickly to talk a little bit about the uses of the Washington data. And as we have been talking about, its primary use, or at least one of the main uses, would be identifying chemicals used in various components across multiple sectors. So really, again, understanding that universe, we're going to be saying that a lot, I'm sure, but understanding that universe of how these chemicals are being used, their commonality across the similar products, similar components, different products, really beginning to see that web and starting to understand those stories. Another use is to refocus resources after better understanding these uses. Within the reporting so far, only 34 of the 66 chemicals that Washington is requiring reporting on have actually been reported. So are those other 32 chemicals, are those Are those of less interest now that there is no reporting on them? Is there something that needs to actually happen to understand why those aren't being reported? There certainly are different ways to begin thinking about the data and perhaps looking at certain questions more or certain chemicals based on the information that's in the database. Creating lists of manufacturers required to report. This is a really important lesson that we learned from the Mercury Added Products database, and the difficulty it really is in the beginning to do the outreach and to understand all of the different types of products and all the different types of manufacturers that might be required to report. In the beginning of the Mercury database, there was a lot of online searching, a lot of opening up of phone books to try to find companies and to try to find contacts to let them know about this type of information. And Washington here is certainly doing a lot of heavy lifting in that they are doing a lot of the outreach, a lot of this research, and beginning to develop these lists, which will be very, very valuable for other states as they begin to come online and to implement their own chemical use reporting disclosure requirements. The chemicals might not be the same, and the types of products might not be exactly the same, but there certainly is going to be some commonality among the manufacturers. So it's really valuable information that's coming into the database. One note that we've heard from states that are considering new disclosure requirements is that they're able to identify chemicals and uses where they have similarities between their product chemical listings. There are states that certainly overlap with some of the chemicals that they have prioritized and are taking action on. And it's an important way to be able to understand some of the information that's coming in about those chemicals, and for the states that have those similar chemicals to be able to readjust and perhaps not even put the reporting requirement on those chemicals because enough information that meets their needs is coming in through another state. And ultimately, a final point just to make, based on the categorization of the system, creating a product-level database, so really looking at the UPC-level kinds of codes, those products that you could identify by walking into a store and picking up off the shelf. That kind of a database for informing purchasing decisions is not applicable directly in this case. But again, there is a potential use to look at these brick codes and perhaps match that with other information. There is other product level information out there. Is there a way to combine that information here and start to link these different resources together? Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the Mercury Use in Products database, the IMERC database. The IMERC database, the whole idea of IMERC came about a little bit differently than how the IC2 was formed. IMERC really, there certainly, of course, is a human health hazard regarding mercury and, of course, environmental hazard. But the IMERC was really developed with more of a solid waste management thought in mind. So the states were very concerned about mercury levels in the region, the New England states. And the information that was out there about mercury use in products was coming out of the USGS, the Geological Survey, and it was a voluntary effort that did not go into very much detail about specific product types and information, or not enough detail, rather, to satisfy the state's needs for trying to understand what kind of products were coming into their borders and how those products were ultimately being disposed of, either by consumers or in an industrial capacity, and ultimately the fate of those products going either into incinerators or into the landfills, and then ultimately that mercury entering into the environment. So the Northeast states launched IMERC in 2001 to begin to gather information about mercury use in products and to serve as a single point of contact for public and industry. And the thought there was to really try to minimize duplicate efforts and try to promote efficiency in developing this program and trying to reach commonality among the states so that information could be shared and this could be a real regional effort, a joint effort. The first reporting on products began in 2001, and reporting is required every 3 years. So the calendar year 2010 is the fourth reporting cycle. The system historically was done with paper forms. We have now moved over to an e-filing system, which the 2010 year was the first year of the e-filing system. So it certainly is more efficient for companies to be able to submit the information now, and also for the states to be able to review it. As I mentioned, there are 15 states that belong to IMERC. 8 of those states require the reporting of the products, and those 8 states have come together and agreed on a common form so that a company only needs to submit one time, and that one-time submission covers all 8 states. They don't have to submit 8 different separate forms to all the states and wait for different answers. And with that comes a harmonized approach. So the states are able to collectively review, discuss, and approve all of these forms. And now with the e-filing system, they're able to do that all electronically as well. The database itself currently houses information on thousands of products from over 500 companies now. And a note about categorization, as I mentioned, thinking about a little bit about the pros and cons of the Washington system, the other way that the IMERC categorization scheme was based on was that there is no common standard. And in the beginning, companies were asked to give as much description and as much information about their products as possible. But the ultimate categorization, how those products were linked together and created into product categories, was done. It was done with input from industry. There was, however, a lot of back and forth with industry about how certain products should be categorized and does this make sense. And it took a lot of effort to try to find common ways to bring together these products so that there could be some useful information out of it. So again, using a common system that Washington is using has a lot of advantages in that it's built into the general processes of the manufacturers that are making these types of products, instead of really having to try to invent things. The one thing with the Mercury Use in products is that there really was nothing to go on, so it did have to get created in a way, and because of the breadth of Mercury Use in products, from lamps to electronics, there are just so many differences that it did take a long time to finally understand the product categorization for those products. So now I'm going to switch over to the online system for the Mercury Added Products database and take you through a little bit of that. So this is the interface for the Mercury Added Products database. The system has 3 general tabs, ways to actually look at the information. The first is to browse by product category. As I mentioned, the categorization happened with a lot of input, and these are the final product categories that the IMERC member states came up with to categorize all the information in the database. There's also a tab to be able to browse by company, so if there is interest in a specific company, you can drill down into that company's information and see all the filings that the company has made over time. And there's also a customized search, which I'll actually go back to once I take a look first at the product categorization. So dental amalgam is one that we like to focus on because of its limited number of manufacturers, so it's easy to navigate. But can certainly see when you click on any of these product categories, it first lists out the amount of companies, the number of companies that have made some kind of product that fits into that description. But again, we'll go with dental amalgam, and we'll go with the first company here. So you can click on the detail for that company, and then that will kick up all of the contact information for that company. And we'll also bring up all of the reports that that company has filed into the IMERC database over the years. So as I mentioned, the first reporting happened in 2001 and has been required every 3 years. So this company has reported a total of 4 times. And for each of these years, you can drill down into the information, see what type of report they formed, and then see all the individual products that were included in that form. So for this example, I'm just going to open up the 2007 and the 2010 report for this company. And you can see all the products that were listed, 3 in 2007 and 5 in 2010. The important thing to note about, or one important thing to note about the Mercury Added Products database is this total mercury value. So there is information here where the company has to report the total amount of grams that are covered under that one particular product based on their sales of that product in the entire U.S. during that calendar year. So for this first product, that 3 million grams covers sales of those products across the entire U.S. So it's not just a database of information for a particular state. It actually covers the entire U.S. So in that case, it's actually a very unique set of data regarding mercury that's been used by not only the IMERF member states, but has been used by a number of NGOs and even in the international treaty negotiations that have been recently going on. So in order to find more detail about one of these products, you simply just click on the View Detail button, and that brings up another little screen. So it shows you information about the product, including the mercury content of that product, and also gives you a snapshot of that total mercury value over time. So you can see how in 2001 and 2004 to 2007, the content dropped significantly and then went back up a little bit in 2010. So this trends analysis, which we'll talk about just in a little bit, is really important for the mercury added product database for a couple of reasons. And again, we'll talk about that in just a minute. So this is the general interface, the general view of how you get into information about a company and to look at the specific product in those listings. Again, as I mentioned, you can browse by company. I won't do that now. You can simply just click on any of the alphabet letters here and get a full listing of companies that begin with that letter. And again, you can browse into those companies and see all the reports that they have done over the years. But the other thing I wanted to focus on here was the customized search. And this is very similar to the way that you're able to search the information in the Washington database once you export it into some kind of spreadsheet or some kind of way to sort the data. We built in the customized search more on the public website side instead of the Excel spreadsheet side, but they essentially do the very similar functions. So again, we're going to look at dental amalgam here. So you just simply select dental amalgam among the product categories that you had options of on the first tab. For the selection, you're able to actually choose if you want to understand if the mercury is its own mercury product or if the mercury is in a component that's part of a larger product. So for example, if you're thinking about a mercury switch, if you select that it's a product by itself, it will just give you the information about mercury switches that were reported. But if you select it as part of a component of a larger product, you will get examples of products such as mercury ovens or pumps or any other kind of product that uses the switch as a smaller part of the larger product. So it's a way to differentiate how you want to actually look at the components. So we're going to, and you can also select both. So in this case, we're going to select both. And then here you have the option of choosing the mercury content that you want to search for, and you can search for multiple ranges by simply selecting multiple values. In this case, we'll just select the 100 to 1,000 and click search. And what the system will do is go and find all of those unique products within the database that meet all that search criteria. So dental amalgam, either as a component or as its own product with a mercury content between 100 and 1,000. One unique thing that the customized search does do is it does look for unique products. One thing that the database does track is a product over time. So if a product has been reported in 2001, 2004, 2007, and 2010, the system recognizes that that is the same exact product if the mercury content doesn't change, if nothing about the product really changes. It considers it the same product. In other cases, in other database, you might get 4 different versions of that same product for each reporting year. So one thing we did try to do was try to minimize the output to the public so that you could really get, again, a snapshot of these products over time to get a sense of the trends and how they're used over time. So with that, I'm going to move back over to my presentation and talk a little bit about the uses of the mercury data. Again, the data in the beginning, as the system was launched and the product information began to come in, it really helped define the universe of products and categories. There really wasn't that much known about the specific uses of mercury. to the extent that it is now known through the database. So it helped define how to categorize these products, such as putting them into categories like switches and relays and measuring devices and thermostats. And that, in turn, helped create a better understanding of the end-of-life impacts. And a lot of that comes from the information that we receive for the number of components per product and the mercury content of those components, so you can really understand what a mercury switch, how much mercury might actually be in that switch in a pretty exact way. Or companies can report through ranges, but you do get a good sense. If a component has over 1 gram of mercury, you can understand what the potential impact is of that product at the end of life. It also informed policy decisions through the state legislatures focusing on labeling and product bans. So understanding the overall impact of a product category, such as switches and relays, understanding how much mercury was coming into the states through those products, and ultimately understanding some of the alternatives and some of the other ways that products could function without those mercury switches and other components as well. It does have the elements of alternatives assessment that the states are currently thinking about with some of these other chemicals as well. It also facilitated compliance with other mercury product requirements, so understanding where certain companies might have to also label their products, or based on component mercury content that they might be banned in one state but not in another. It really helped to focus the outreach and the information provided to the companies to come into compliance with the requirements. And also this information has been used and shared with the EPA. So really throughout the whole process of IMERC, EPA has been very involved. And the particular system that I just showed you, and the e-filing system that's now available, was funded by the National Environmental Information Exchange Network, so the NEIN grant program that some of you may be familiar with. So the information in the Mercury database is actually fully accessible by EPA or essentially by any of the states that are involved with the network. So that information there can be downloaded. Basically, the entire database can be downloaded by someone and analyzed in ways that we might not be doing it if they're interested in some other ways to look at the data that we don't. One thing to note, though, however, is that while looking at all this raw data and all this raw information, there is value in it. There's also the interest in giving the public information and knowledge that you can't really get from looking at the data. So you can look at all these companies and numbers and try to do all the categorization, but there are stories behind it, and there's information behind it that's not necessarily going to be known. Some of it's just known by the IMERC staff that have been working on this for so long, or the state representatives that know all this information inherently. So what we've done is take this information a little bit further and develop product category fact sheets and trends analysis so that the public can actually understand in clearer language and really combining all of this data into larger numbers what this actually means. So the product category fact sheets, again, they look at the specific product categories like switches and relays, talk about the uses of switches and relays, talk about the alternatives, talk about disposal, the mercury content, basic information that the public would probably be, it's certainly much more digestible to the public than the raw data. And it also enables the states to look at trends analyses. So in this bar graph, you can see how the use of switches and relays, the total mercury values that have been reported to IMERC, have dropped substantially from 2001 to 2007. So it's a way for the IMERC states to really assess the success of their mercury efforts and to really see these product categories that have been of concern and to see what kinds of success there has been because of the legislation that's been going on. So, having looked at these two systems and going back to our project goals and the questions that we want to be posing to stakeholders and others about how to actually think about chemical use disclosure, what questions do users want to address using this chemical use data? And this is a real issue that we found out, I would say, late in the game with the mercury data, is that there wasn't as much forethought into how this data might be used and the formulation of the actual reporting process itself. And over time, we have had to adjust the ways that the database works and the information that's received by the states from companies, and really had to try to fit things together in ways that would have been much easier and much less labor-intensive if we had known these questions and known the ultimate value beforehand and been able to build that into the system in the beginning. So what information is needed? What are the data fields? What is the data that is needed to answer those questions? And also, what is the format to be asking for? What format is most accessible and useful to the variety of stakeholders? Is it things like fact sheets that really present it in a digestible manner, or is it really raw data for people who are interested in manipulating the data and using database programs to be able to do that? And again, ultimately, how can we analyze and present data and turn information into knowledge and action? A brief word about the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse for those that might not be so familiar with it. The Clearinghouse right now is an association of 12 state and local governments, and there are also a number of supporting members. Those supporting members include companies, NGOs, academic institutions. And I listed here really the 3 mission statements of the IC2: to avoid duplication and enhance efficiency and effectiveness of these initiatives on chemicals, to build government capacity to identify and promote safer chemicals and products, and to ensure that agencies, businesses, and the public have ready access to high-quality data and information. And really, this project on chemical use disclosure and the thoughts behind it really meet all of those mission statements of the IC2. Briefly, so far the IC2 has been working on thinking about some of these issues. The IC2 did develop a chemical use reporting white paper a couple of years ago that, among other things, outlines the benefits of collaborating with one another, describes the state confidential business information policies, because those certainly play into the kinds of information that can be collected and shared. And we also presented a draft straw common reporting form, so really using IMERC, the Mercury data, as a model and trying to find out if there's one form that could meet the needs of several states, again, to try to avoid duplication, to make the actual reporting easier for companies, and to increase the efficiency by perhaps having multiple states review the same kind of information. And they're currently thinking about some of these technical considerations and policy discussions that surround this. They've been trying to harmonize legislative language to coordinate. Is there a place for coordinating disclosure compliance and product testing? Is there an ability to share submissions and alternatives? There are many policy discussions and issues that come into play because of this, such as the confidential business information. But the states are actively thinking about this and talking about this, and really want to widen the discussion and bring it to a larger group of stakeholders, which is why we're here today. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Terry to talk about some next steps.
Thanks, Adam. One thing I want to clarify that you said, you implied or said that the IMERC data is flowing to EPA right now, and it's actually not yet. The intent is to do that. We've sent EPA the structure of the database, what they call the schema, and we're waiting for their response to make that possible. Hello? So in any case, we hope in the foreseeable future that there will be a complete data flow through what's called a node through to EPA, so that they can have full access to the database. That's part of the original project, but we're sort of in a holding pattern, waiting for their response at this point. In any case, so some of the next steps. So through the process of working with Biz NGO Network, the GC3, and the Product Stewardship Institute, 3 of our partners who work with a whole bunch of different stakeholders, the IC2 hopes to identify interested stakeholders who might want to continue to hold discussions and think about some of the key challenges and questions that Adam has laid out. So what we're hoping to do is, take the list of people who participated and registered in today's webinar, and others who have written to us about the webinar. I don't know, Adam, if you mentioned that we're taping this and we'll make that available for those who could not join us today. There were a number of those, so we'll have a list of what we consider to be interested stakeholders, and we hope to follow up with all of you to plan a series of events. We'll follow up and get your initial, if any of you have initial feedback and comments on what you've seen today and are interested in sharing those with us by email, we'll certainly be open to that. We're hoping to have a conference call of people interested in helping us plan a face-to-face meeting this spring, probably late in the spring, where we really want to take up the kinds of Adam's questions in much more detail throughout probably a full-day meeting. And during that meeting, we hope to make it possible for people to participate by webinar who aren't able to come in person. So we want to have a conference call to plan that meeting. We'd love to get input from you know, all the different stakeholders that we've been working with to plan this webinar. Following up on the spring meeting, once we get some more you know, views from a variety of people of what they'd like to see with this data, we hope to you know, write up the results and then begin to do some data analysis using you know, the kind of input we've received. See if we can analyze the data in various ways that people say they want to look at it, and create some models for data analysis and presentation. And following that, you know, draft some of those, then follow up with another conference call to see, you know, if what some of this data analysis is on target and whether or not, you know, there's other issues. In the course of this, we hope to develop some recommendations if we need to change the format of the data or the data systems. You know, those are some recommendations we hope can come out of this process. All of this will be summarized in a final report. Again, we'll make all of that available on the web, and we'll inform, you know, all of you about the outcome of this sort of year-long effort. Next slide. So I think with that, Adam, you want to open this up for discussion, and I think you want people to pose their questions using the question or function in the box on the right side of the screen. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can do that if you want to write out the full question, or I can also just call on people. Why don't we try I'll call on people in the beginning here, and we can go in order, and then yeah, we can open up to people to answer. So Bradley, I'm going to unmute you here for your question to Washington State.
Oh, thanks, Adam. We just had a question in our region about what the definition of manufacturer is for you guys. A lot of our states kind of struggle with, you know, how to define that group of people. And I was wondering how that worked in your state legislatively. And then do you include small and mid-sized businesses or processors or formulators of chemicals, or are you straight out just covering products? And then finally, is there a good degree of compliance?
And I'm going to pass that over to John Williams. Hopefully, John, are you there?
I'm here, but I need to call you.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, I just do that. I didn't know that. Sure. The way it's working is we phased in the smaller businesses over time, and that's part of the way we tried to meet some of the requirements in terms of economic impacts on the smaller businesses. So the reporting is phased in both by gross income. The more you make, the sooner you report, and the tier of products, which I think was already covered. So yes, small businesses are included. There is no, in the law, there is no lower limit to how far down this goes. As far as compliance goes, I actually think it's too early to say. So I'll just leave it at that. And then in terms of the stakeholder involvement, legislatively, I wasn't involved in that. In terms of the rule itself, I did a pretty big outreach program, both through trade organizations, some of the larger corporations, small business associations, and anyone who wanted to provide input. The reality was, as a general statement, the small businesses did not have the resources to provide much, whereas the larger businesses certainly invested much more effort. Does that answer that?
John, let me help you. This is Terry. Can you hear me?
Yep.
To answer the first part of your is it Bradley's question, which is how do you define how do you define the manufacturer? That's, yeah, I mean, let me try to handle that for IMERC, and you can answer that for Washington, because it's obviously a really critical question, and one the states have certainly struggled with, as you noted. So first of all, the whole reporting, at least for the Mercury products information, is triggered by either the desire to sell or the actual sale of a product into those states that have the reporting requirements. That's where their legal authority starts. And in the case of the Mercury products situation, the entity that reports is either the actual manufacturer, the company that makes the product and wants to sell it in the States, or the distributor who wants to sell the product or is selling the product in the state. And because you want to include distributors, because some of these products are made obviously abroad, and the manufacturer's not here, and it's via some importer distributor in the U.S. that the product becomes available in the state. So in this case, they're both companies. In the case of the IMERC database, we ask distributors to tell us who the manufacturers are. Sometimes that's confidential information and of concern to them. But I think Adam sort of alluded to this. This is sometimes very confusing, because the companies whose name is on the product may not be the actual company that physically makes the product or even distributes it in the United States. You can have another name of the company that appears on the product because they're contracting with someone else to make the product, or because of various aspects, how the supply chain works and how the product's distributed in the United States. So this can be kind of confusing. Adam, I don't know if you want to add anything to this, but it's part of what you have to think through in implementing any reporting requirement like this. Who does it apply to? Who actually does the reporting? And it's something the IMERC states have certainly wrestled with as they've implemented this requirement, and it kind of creates some kind of confusion. Because you can look in the database and think, oh, I think that this is a company that makes, say, X lamp, because that's the name of the, whose name appears on the lamp, but it's actually not the company that actually does the reporting. So there may be different entities involved, because these are complex supply chains, and you're trying to understand, the different aspects of these complex supply chains and who these reporting requirements apply to, and who does the reporting, and who actually makes the product. I don't know, Adam. What do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you said it well. I mean, it's something the IMERC states have certainly struggled with. I mean, one of the perfect examples in the Mercury Added Products database is looking for Subaru cars, because the actual reporting is done by the parent company, Fuji Heavy Industries. And if you're going to look for a Subaru car, you're not going to look under Fuji Heavy Industries. So it is something that. And again, the IMERC states, the representatives and IMERC staff, we build up this knowledge in our brains over time, so we can answer those kinds of questions. But getting that information out to the public is a whole different thing. So it's really translating that knowledge base to make that information useful to the public. It's a challenge. It's a totally different thing.
So John, I don't know if you want to add anything from Washington's perspective on the children's.
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest thing that everyone's learning is how complex the supply chain is. But to answer the question manufacturer is required to report first. Next up would be the importer. And so you either make it in the U.S. or you bring it into the U.S. So those are the parties that have to report, not the chemical companies themselves. I think that was part of your question. And there are penalties. It's a civil penalty of $5,000 per violation. And I think the biggest issue that no one has really mentioned too is this whole idea of not just who makes it, but who's paying someone else to put their name on the product. So one way to deal with that might be like on our electronics recycling bill, whoever name is on the lamp, to use earlier example, they're the responsible party. That is not how the Children Safe Products Act, but certainly a law could be crafted that way to whoever's brand is on that product is the person or company that's held responsible for the reporting. In our case, a lot of the bigger companies, others are reporting on their behalf, but the data is tied to the larger company.
One thing I should mention is that in the case of the Mercury products database, Mercury product requirements, there's no distinction between large and small companies for reporting purposes. So you can be a very small company bringing in a specialty product for sale in the states that have the requirement, and you have to report just the same as any large company. And there's no, the reporting is triggered because you intentionally put mercury in the product. So there's no reporting requirement for contaminant levels of mercury. So but again, there's no de minimis level. In other words, if you put in, you know, a very tiny amount of mercury deliberately in your product, that triggers the reporting requirement. There's no threshold below which you don't have to report. So it's just triggered by, you know, assuming the mercury is used in the product for some reason intentionally is what triggers the requirement.
Thanks, guys. That was really helpful.
I wanted to call on Eileen Sheehan, too, because you had a follow-up question about compliance with Washington. Eileen, are you there? Okay, well, we'll maybe put that on hold and move on to Clinton Boyd. You had a question here. I'm going to unmute you. You want to go ahead?
Adam, why don't you just read out my question? That'll be fine. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Okay. So the question is, the examples shown focused on reporting of products that contain specific chemicals, for example, mercury. Will the discussion going forward also focus on strategies for product-level chemical ingredient disclosure? Someone want to take a crack at that?
Well, we can only require what the law gives us authority to do. So our law right now isn't worded that way. What we've tried to do to help people kind of see the grouping, once again, is the different tiers of products. So the first products up were ones that you're stuck in your mouth, rubbed on your skin, or for kids under 3. But we have not done by product, and we currently don't have the legal authority to do so, at least on this reporting.
Joel, I want to. Joel's not on the phone, so let me check again. Is Eileen there? Do you have a question about compliance? No, and Clinton, I'm sorry, I didn't even finish your question. Does that answer your question? Do you have something more specific you wanted to ask about the product level?
Yeah, I understand that the current examples that were shown were based on laws, but you know, one of the comments that was made about next step and identifying stakeholders was looking at all these models and figuring out as we go forward how we can streamline all these different state initiatives. So, for example, when California comes online, there could be a lot more information, a lot more chemicals, and they have like 230 chemicals of concern that they're after. So I was just wondering if, once all this data got compiled and collated, whether there would be somewhere down the line the idea of trying to generate, a specific, chemical disclosure for a product, kind of merging all these different data streams so we can get not just look up one chemical, but look up a product and say, these are all the chemicals of concern that are in this product.
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, I think some of it is certainly based on the laws and what the information that the states can ask for. I mean, New York is going in kind of a different direction. They are looking the other way and looking at products instead and understanding the chemicals that are in those products. So it is a different way to try to get at that information and really to see a holistic view of the product itself and not just the specific chemicals, say, in a certain product. So in that way, that information would be more readily available. And again, it gets down, I think, too, to just the level of information and the level of detail that states are asking for. I mean, it certainly is a question, and it's really why we're asking it and trying to get it into the focus now is, it would be great to get to that point where you could do this kind of collation of all of these different streams and really find out information about products.
I appreciate it wouldn't be a full disclosure, but I'm just saying that right now, if I want to know if a certain product contains mercury, I go to this database. If I want to know if it contains any of the Washington 66, I go to another database.
Mm-hmm.
It would be nice if I could just say, look up a product and say, okay, it does contain these chemicals because it's been reported to this state, or it contains this chemical because it's been reported from another state.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's something of the vision of IC2, but we're sort of struggling with how to do exactly what you're saying. I don't know that we've thought about merging what Washington's done with what the IMERC model, but we're trying to find opportunities for where we can, make it easier, certainly, for people to access this information, and that's part of this dialogue right now. So that's the kind of input we're looking for.
Thank you.
Part of what makes that difficult, too, is at least in Washington's case, we decided to ask for data that isn't product-specific, but it's more component-specific across a wide range of product categories to try to look at the supply chain idea so that if you found a chemical that's used for a dye in one component but in multiple product categories, by working on that chemical, you could have a much broader effect than just for one single product. So our data doesn't really give anyone the ability to look up something on a product-by-product, level detail, but it's more by product category. But our thinking was it was more important to get the detail on the component side of it than the product itself.
I mean, Adam, I don't know if you want to navigate to the white paper that we did, but Adam mentioned this white paper where, that's one of the things we did in the white paper, among other things, is look at some of the other existing data systems for product use, chemical use in products reporting, particularly in Europe, for example, and in other cases in the U.S. And one of the messages that we learned, particularly from the European experience, is if we want to try to create more of a unified system for data sharing and presentation, we really need to think about how to do that from the beginning. To do it once a bunch of systems are developed and try to kind of harmonize those systems becomes very difficult, both technically and sort of institutionally, really. So, I don't know if folks are familiar with the white paper. It's posted on the IC2 website. We didn't give the IC2 website URL, but maybe Adam can show it or something if you can find it. I mean, if you can get to it.
Yeah, with all the follow-up, we'll include the link to the IC2 and specifically to the white paper and to that research paper that looks at other chemical use disclosure systems. Yep. Joel, you had a question. Can I turn to you?
Yep, I'm here. I mean, first a comment. I think
John, you raised a good point here, and Clinton, that there's sort of multiple uses here. One is what Clinton said, which is just to know what's in it for a product or a product category. As John was sort of saying, you can also look at a chemical and think about where it's being used functionally. I know, Terry, you've raised with the mercury, with the iMerc, you found out that mercury was used in things you never would have thought it was used in, and that helps us to sort of target functional use for alternatives assessment. And those are very different uses of the data. One is more what the public might want, or a downstream user trying to figure out what's in a formulation. The other is where government might be to try and understand, well, where are we going to focus our alternatives assessment resources? My question is more about trying to think about this distinction between intentionally added and contaminants, and how to think about that in the context of these databases. Intentionally added, obviously, is a much easier thing to collect information on. And when you get to contaminants, where, and I've heard this with the Washington database, where a brand is so far removed from the parts, the components coming from multiple suppliers, that you're almost taking an educated guess that you think it's there. And I know in footwear and apparel, the AAFA came up with a list of, where we think things are. How can that data be useful, or how do we make that data useful, or is it useful compared to the intentionally added ingredients type data? And then there's this distinction between products or articles and formulated products. The European registries are all formulated products, and I guess my bigger question is, do we start somewhere and build up the mechanisms and the databases, and then keep expanding, with intentionally added formulated ingredients, and then expand to articles where it gets much more complicated? So it's a broad question for John, for Terry, for Adam, of where do we start here? Because this is a huge undertaking. I think you hit it on the nose, Terry, with the Europeans' point is, let's try and figure out how to make these things talk together and integrate early, than trying to figure it out later.
Well, for me personally, I think what's most interesting are those chemicals that were intentionally added to serve a function, because those would be the ones you could look at to come up potentially with an alternative that could serve that function. I think for the contaminant side of it, the reason we collect both is, while the party wanting to do the alternative assessment clearly cares if it's a contaminant or if it's intentionally added, your body doesn't. So we wanted to have some mechanism to get a sense of sources from contaminant as well as intentionally added. And in some cases, the same chemical will be in both categories depending on the product sector that it's in. So it also helps inform what's the potential total body load, and then that might also drive which chemicals to look at more closely, sooner rather than later. You are correct, though. I mean, there is a difference between the two chemical categories, and alternative assessments, to me, should first go after the intentionally added stuff. One thing that's a little tricky, though, is in some cases what's called a contaminant might be due actually to sloppy manufacturing. So in some cases, by not using what's available out there when you manufacture a product, you can have more of a contaminant than your competitors. And in that case, it brings up that whole issue of, is that intentional then? It's not easy.
Joel, in terms of picking up on what John said, as we noted, at least in the case of the Mercury products database, it's only intentionally added, and the reason for that, among other things, I mean, when we work, the Mercury product notification requirement came out of some model legislation that the Northeast states developed over a course of a couple of years, and initially that model legislation did did require some reporting on certainly certain categories of products where you might see some unintentional mercury in the products. And that was taken out of the legislation partly because the manufacturers have no idea when there might be contamination of their product and what might be contaminating their product. And, you know, it might vary from batch to batch. So it can be really complicated for them. It depends on what their raw material sources are. It depends on what happens in the manufacturing facilities. You know, mercury is an element. It can, in very, very low levels, be a contaminant because it's in some of the raw materials as a contaminant, or maybe in the air, or maybe on equipment. So, you know, that was all hard to distinguish. But from a public policy point of view, you know, I think the states felt there's plenty of intentional uses of mercury, and a lot at that time, especially in the late 90s and, you know, early 2000s. There's so much mercury going into the environment from intentional uses. Let's focus our efforts there to begin with. And, you know, if we are able to address those intentional uses, we can then maybe begin to talk to companies about looking at, you know, areas where we suspect there might be some contamination at levels that might be meaningful in some way, maybe in wastewater treatment plants that have to meet very low discharge limits for mercury, for example. That's one area that came up. And where contamination, you know, non-intentional use might be an issue. So, you know, this is something we need to continue to wrestle with, but, you know, I think at least from many of the states is they want to get a handle on these intentional uses first because we assume that they're much larger and therefore potentially have a more significant effect, either public health or environment or whatever we're particularly concerned with.
And Clinton had a follow-up question regarding this and asking, are there different reporting systems that are defining intentional and contaminant in the same way?
Well, I think the two systems we saw today define them in the same way pretty much. I mean, what I will say is that, you know, in our experience talking to companies, you know, as I said, they have these complex supply chains. You know, for them to track they often don't even know what the intentional uses are, and they have to then work with their supply chains to understand that. When it comes to contaminants, the sky's the limit for them, and they'd have to do some much more rigorous product testing than they do now. And again, you know, especially with formulated products, you know, the potential for contaminants could be even from batch to batch, and you don't know what those contaminants are, and so this raises a lot of issues for them. It goes beyond just simply reporting. It really gets into product testing and what's going to be required, you know, from that point of view. I don't know, John, if you want to add anything to that, but I don't think there's a big distinction in how we define intentional versus unintentional uses, but I may be wrong about that.
Well, for us right now, if it serves a function in the product, we're saying that's intentional, and I think that's similar to other laws and or systems I've looked at. And I also think it's in some ways easier on the reporting side for formulated in the sense that it's formulated, so you know what the formula is, so you know what your intentional chemicals are anyway. When it comes to contaminant, as Terry said, it could be just the opposite because it's easy. You're making something in batches for one batch to be slightly different than the other batch. We also try to deal with the contaminant issue by having a higher reporting trigger than the intentionally added chemicals. So for the contaminants, our reporting trigger is 100 parts per million, whereas on intentionally added, the same chemical, its trigger might be, you know, 1 part per million.
I mean, Joel also asked about formulated versus fabricated products, and you know, the IMERC system covers both. And so again, defining formulated and fabricated products and how you report mercury in those different kinds of products was something that was really had to be worked out from the beginning. The Washington, you know, I think in Washington, you're mostly focusing on formulated products, if I'm not mistaken.
No,
so
it covers both. It covers both.
These covers both. That's right. So these are important distinctions, and they do have implications. One of the things we did learn early on in the Mercury product disclosure is that, we thought companies, I think our perception was companies have these very precise recipes for what's in their products and, follow those rigorously. And in some cases that's true, but we also found out in cases it's just not true. That the mercury levels in a product can vary widely, even within a single, company manufacturing, because it doesn't have to be that precise. So we found that for lamps, for example, there has to be a minimal amount of mercury in the lamp for it to work properly, but if there's more than that, it still works. So they don't necessarily have to have extremely precise recipes. Now that will vary a lot from product to product, and even in mercury products. But it isn't across the board that every product formulation has to be precise to the milligram or something, or 1 part per million. The other reason why both Washington and the IMERC system allow reporting in ranges rather than asking for exact amounts of the product, the chemical of concern, is a way of addressing confidential business information and trying to get useful information without having to trigger a lot of CBI claims and concerns and a lot of CBI issues. And we found that companies are much more willing to report in ranges, in part because some of them, that is their formulation. It's not exact. It's not exact to the some very precise amount, and so it enabled us to, at least in some of these cases, get a lot of data and not have to face a lot of CBI issues.
Great. Well, that brings us to time. It's 2:30, so I want to thank everyone who attended today. We really appreciate your participation, and we really hope to be working with you further on this project. We will be sending some follow-up information about the posting of the presentation and the recording, and also some additional information about the IC2, including the IC2 white paper link, and some background information about the research paper on other kinds of chemical disclosure programs. But with that, we want to thank you again, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.